They say every train carries more than freight. Some haul sorrow. Others drag women halfway across a country just to be told they're not wanted. When Maybel stepped off that platform, she wasn't the bride. Hell, she wasn't even expected. She was the sister who stayed behind. The quiet one. The second choice. But Snow has a funny way of hiding what's worth keeping. And out there on the cold prairie, where men speak less than the wind does, she found out what happens when the one who stays decides she ain't leaving. It's not a love story. Not yet. It's a story about showing up when no one asks you to, and staying even when the world tells you you're just a shadow. What would you have done? Walked away like they expected, or made a life out of what someone else threw away? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Let's see how that story went down. The biting Montana wind, sharp as a shard of river ice, whipped around Red Bluff Station, carrying with it a flurry of fresh snow that clung to Clara Vale's eyelashes and the threadbare shoulders of her Missouri-made coat. Each gust seemed to echo the hollowness in her chest, a feeling more profound than the mere chill of the late afternoon. Gideon Hart, the man whose name was signed to the letters that had drawn her 1,000 miles from home, was nowhere to be seen, only a curt message, delivered by a station master whose eyes held a pity she didn't want, had informed her Mr. Hart would not be coming. No explanation. No apology, just an absence. Clara clutched the small, sealed envelope in her gloved hand. Inside, her own words, penned with a resolute heart days before, lay dormant. I decline. She'd written it as a shield, a desperate preemption against a fate she'd increasingly dreaded. The letters from Gideon, though polite, had painted a picture of a transaction, not a union. He'd spoken of his ranch, its needs, the necessity of a wife to manage the domestic sphere. Never once had he asked about her dreams, her laughter, or the quiet poems she sometimes scribbled in the margins of her mother's old almanac. He was acquiring a helpmate, not a soulmate, and Clara, for all her quiet desperation to escape a future of genteel poverty back east, couldn't bring herself to be a mere line item in a rancher's ledger. But standing there, officially jilted before she could enact her own refusal, felt like a colder, sharper rejection. The humiliation was a raw, open wound. She'd imagined handing him the letter with a composed dignity, a quiet assertion of her own worth. Now, the letter felt like a fool's errand, a testament to a courage she hadn't been given the chance to display. The station master, a grizzled man named Jebediah, had offered her a corner near the potbelly stove for the night. "Ain't no trains back east till mornin', ma'am," he'd said, his voice rough but not unkind. And the hotel? Well, it ain't fittin' for a lady alone after dark, not with the news already spreadin'. News, of course. In a town as small as Red Bluff, a jilted mail-order bride was undoubtedly the choicest morsel of gossip. Clara imagined the whispers, the knowing glances. She felt her cheeks burn despite the cold. She'd spent her meager savings on the train ticket, on a new dress that now seemed a mockery, on hopes that had turned to ash in the Montana wind. She hadn't slept, not truly. The rhythmic tick-tock of the station clock, the occasional mournful howl of a distant coyote, and the incessant replay of her predicament had kept her mind churning. Each creak of the floorboards made her jump, half expecting Gideon Hart to appear, a looming shadow full of judgment or, worse, indifference. When dawn finally bled, a pale, hesitant light through the grimy station windows, it found Clara hollow-eyed and bone-weary, the unopened letter still clutched in her hand. A blast of frigid air heralded the arrival of the morning train, its whistle a shrill cry against the frozen landscape. Clara barely registered it, her thoughts already turning to the grim prospect of the return journey, the explanations she would have to offer, the quiet shame that would follow her home. Clara, the voice, young and startlingly familiar, cut through her despair. Clara's head snapped up, standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the snow-bright morning, was a figure she knew as well as her own reflection, yet couldn't quite believe she was seeing. "Maybel," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "What in heaven's name?" Her younger sister, Maybel Vale, not yet 18, bundled in a coat too thin for the journey, and clutching a worn carpet bag, stepped fully into the dim light of the station. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes, those bright, determined eyes, held a spark that Clara hadn't seen in her own for a long time. In Maybel's outstretched hand was another envelope, identical to the one Clara held, her I-declined letter. "You didn't send it," Maybel stated, her voice surprisingly steady. "I found it on your dresser when you didn't come back from the post office. I just knew." Clara felt a flush of anger, quickly followed by a wave of weary resignation. "Knew what?" "Maybel, that I was making a fool of myself, chasing a dream that was never meant to be. I knew you were scared." "Clara," Maybel said, stepping closer, her gaze unwavering. "Scared of being trapped, scared of ending up like Mama, always looking out the window, waiting for something that never came." The words struck a painful chord. Their mother, worn down by years of quiet disappointment, had been a constant, unspoken warning. "And you, what are you doing here?" Clara demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Did you follow me? How did you even pay for the ticket?" Maybel's chin lifted. "I sold Mama's locket. The one you always said was too gaudy." She took a deep breath. "I'm here to take your place." Clara stared at her, aghast. "Take my place? Maybel, are you mad? This isn't some game. This is Gideon Hart, a man who discards a woman without a word, like she's a sack of unwanted grain." "He hasn't met me," Maybel said simply. "He rejected the idea of you." Clara, the you he read in letters, the you who was too afraid to even meet him, too proud to be anything but a perfect porcelain doll. "And you think he'll welcome you with open arms?" Clara's laugh was brittle, a last-minute substitute. "He'll send you packing on the next train, just like he would have me, if I'd even gotten that far." "Maybe," Maybel conceded, her gaze softening just a fraction. "But you, Clara, you're afraid of losing yourself in a marriage that isn't a grand romance. Me," she gestured to herself, a small, almost defiant motion. "I'm afraid I'll never even get the chance to choose anything. Back home, it's Mr. Henderson from the Mercantile, with his damp hands and his talk of ledgers, or it's nothing, just fading away. Like you said, like Mama." The raw honesty in her sister's voice silenced Clara for a moment. She saw the desperation in Maybel's eyes, a mirror of her own, but with a different, fiercer edge. Where Clara had sought escape from a potentially loveless union, Maybel was seeking an escape to any union, any chance at a life beyond the stifling confines of their small Missouri town. "He's a stranger, Maybel, a hard man. From what I gather, this land, it's beautiful, but it's harsh. It could break you." "Then let it try," Maybel said, her voice ringing with a conviction that seemed too large for her small frame. She stepped forward and gently took Clara's unopened letter from her numb fingers, placing her own beside it on the dusty windowsill. "You go home, Clara. Go home and write your poems. Find a man who will read them to you by the fire. That's your dream." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the snow-covered platform outside, towards the distant, rugged mountains. "This she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This is mine. Or at least, the chance for one. Clara felt a confusing mix of fear for her sister and a reluctant, painful admiration. Maybel had always been the impulsive one, the one who leaped before she looked. But there was a core of steel in her that Clara, for all her quiet resilience, perhaps lacked. They'll talk, Clara warned, her voice weak. The town. They'll call you the cast-off sister, the replacement. Maybel's lips curved into a small, determined smile. Let them. Words are just air. It's what a person does that matters. She picked up her carpet bag. Is his ranch far? Clara, still reeling, could only nod towards the livery stable Jebediah had pointed out earlier. He was supposed to send a wagon. Then I suppose I'll have to inquire about hiring one, Maybel said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Clara, she said, her voice softer now, don't think I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. And then, with a resolve that seemed to fill the cold station air, she added, I'm not coming here expecting to be loved right off. I'm coming here to be seen. And then, I reckon I'll have to teach them how to love me. Whoever they might be. With that, she was gone, a small, determined figure marching out into the biting wind, leaving Clara alone with two identical letters and a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The journey to the Hart Ranch was a solitary one for Maybel, jolting along in a hired buckboard driven by a taciturn young man who offered no conversation beyond the price of the ride. The landscape was vast, intimidating, a canvas of whites and grays under an enormous sky. Mountains, jagged and snow-capped, loomed in the distance, their silence as profound as Gideon Hart's had been. When they finally reached the sprawling ranch, marked by a sturdy timber archway bearing the name Hartwood, Maybel felt a tremor of apprehension, quickly suppressed. The main house was a large, two-story log structure, solid and imposing, smoke curling from its stone chimney, a sign of life. At least, Gideon Hart himself met her at the door. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of sun and wind and hard decisions. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were startlingly direct, and they narrowed slightly as they took in the sight of her. Younger, smaller, and undoubtedly not the woman he'd been expecting. Maybel didn't wait for him to speak. Mr. Hart, she began, her voice clear despite the tremor in her knees. I am Maybel Vale. Clara. My sister. She couldn't. She faltered, then straightened. She decided against the arrangement. I've come in her stead. Silence. A long, measuring silence that stretched Maybel's nerves taut. Gideon Hart's expression didn't change. He simply looked at her, his gaze unreadable. She could feel the driver of the buckboard shifting uncomfortably behind her, eager to be paid and gone. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. Come in. It wasn't a welcome. Not exactly. It was a command, devoid of warmth, but also, surprisingly, devoid of immediate dismissal. Inside, the house was dark, dominated by heavy wooden furniture and the smell of wood smoke and old leather. A woman, older, with a stern, unsmiling face and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features taut, emerged from a shadowy hallway. This, Maybel surmised, must be Enid, the housekeeper Gideon had mentioned in his letters to Clara. Letters Maybel had surreptitiously read. Enid's gaze flickered over Maybel with an indifference that was almost more chilling than outright hostility. Tea? She asked, her voice flat, addressing no one in particular. Gideon Hart merely grunted, his eyes still on Maybel. The sister, he said to Enid. By way of explanation, Enid's thin lips tightened almost imperceptibly. I'll prepare the East room. The slightest hesitation before the word East spoke volumes. It was clearly not the room intended for the bride. And so began Maybel's life at Heartwood. Gideon Hart accepted her presence with that same stoic silence. He did not call her wife, nor did he offer any terms for her staying. He simply allowed it. He gave her chores, tasks that Clara, with her more delicate upbringing, would have found daunting, but which Maybel tackled with a quiet determination. She mucked stalls when the ranch hands were short, helped Enid with the endless laundry and cooking, and learned to mend thick canvas tarps and sturdy denim trousers. The town of Red Bluff, as Clara had predicted, buzzed. Whispers followed Maybel whenever she had cause to go for supplies. The substitute, they called her. The one who wasn't chosen. Some looked at her with pity, others with a thinly veiled contempt. Children sometimes pointed, but Maybel held her head high. She met their gazes directly, offered polite greetings, and went about her business. She hadn't come to Red Bluff to win a popularity contest. Enid remained a formidable, silent presence. Her disapproval was a constant, unspoken thing, a chill in the air that Maybel learned to navigate, if not ignore. There were no conversations about her future, no discussions about her role on the ranch beyond the daily grind. She was an occupant, not a partner. Yet, Maybel stayed. Each sunrise over the vast, indifferent landscape was a small victory. She wasn't waiting to be loved. Not anymore. That youthful, naive hope had been tempered by the harsh realities of her situation. Instead, she focused on something more fundamental. She was waiting to live, to carve out a space for herself in this wild, untamed corner of the world, to be seen not as Clara's shadow or Gideon Hart's unclaimed mail-order bride, but as Maybel Vale, a woman who had chosen her own path, however uncertain, and was determined to walk it with her eyes wide open, ready to teach the world, and perhaps even one stoic rancher, exactly who she was. The silence of the ranch was profound, but Maybel was learning to fill it with the quiet hum of her own resilience. The silence of Heartwood, as Maybel had quickly learned, was a language all its own. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but rather one filled with the unspoken, the utilitarian, the steady, demanding rhythm of work that Gideon Hart embodied, and the land itself seemed to dictate. The ranch operated with a cold efficiency, a well-oiled machine where sentimentality had no gear to turn. Every task had its purpose, every movement its economy. There was a stark kind of beauty to it, Maybel supposed, like the crystalline perfection of a snowflake. Yet it lacked the warmth of a hearth, the gentle give and take of human connection. She lived in the spaces between the thud of an axe splitting firewood, the distant lowing of cattle, the metallic clang of the dinner bell, and the terse, necessary exchanges that passed for conversation. Yet, in this landscape of emotional austerity, Maybel began to find her own peculiar way of belonging, not through words, but through the steady, earnest labor of her hands. She learned the heft of a full milk pail, the sting of lye soap on chapped skin, the deep satisfaction of a well-darned sock. She asked for no quarter and offered no complaint, meeting the dawn with a resolve that mirrored the unyielding peaks on the horizon. She was teaching herself to be a part of Heartwood's rhythm, hoping that in doing so, the place, and perhaps its taciturn master, might eventually make a space for her. It was in the smallest, most fleeting of gestures that she began to sense something other than stoic indifference from Gideon Hart. These were things unsaid, actions without preamble or explanation, so subtle they might have been figments of her hopeful imagination. One morning, after a particularly cold snap that had left her thin Missouri boots soaked through. She found a pair of older, sturdier, sheepskin-lined boots placed neatly outside her door. They were well worn, clearly a man's, but small enough to suggest they might have been his from a younger age, or perhaps belonged to someone long gone. No words were exchanged. He never mentioned them. She never thanked him. She simply wore them, and her feet were warm. Another evening, after a long day helping Enid render lard, a task that left her hands raw and aching, she found a small tin of soothing calendula salve beside her plate at the supper table. Enid, who missed nothing, merely raised a questioning eyebrow towards Gideon, who continued to eat, his gaze fixed on his meal, as if the tin had materialized from thin air. Maybel murmured a quiet, "Thank you" to the room at large, and later, the scent of calendula was a small comfort in the cold solitude of her east room. Then came the bookshelf. A small, roughly hewn set of shelves appeared one day in a corner of her room, smelling faintly of fresh-cut pine, and on it, a half-dozen books, a well-thumbed copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a collection of Emerson's essays, and a book on identifying wildflowers of the Mountain West. These were echoes of the few precious volumes she had brought with her, books Clara had often dismissed as impractical. Gideon must have seen them, noted them, perhaps even understood something of her hidden hunger for words and beauty. The gesture was so unexpected, so profoundly out of character for the man she thought she knew, that it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, her heart a confused mix of gratitude and a strange, burgeoning tenderness that scared her more than the harshest Montana winter. These unspoken things, these quiet acknowledgments, were like fragile wildflowers pushing through frozen earth. Tiny, tenacious signs of life in an otherwise barren emotional terrain. The winter deepened, blanketing Heartwood in a thick, suffocating silence of snow. Days blurred into a routine of indoor chores, the wind howling a mournful song around the eaves of the sturdy log house. It was during one such blizzard, a white fury that raged for 3 days and nights, trapping them all indoors, that the carefully constructed walls around Gideon Hart showed their first visible crack. He'd gone out to check on a newborn calf in the near barn, dismissing Enid's concerns with a curt, "It needs to be done." Hours later, when he hadn't returned, a cold dread had begun to settle in Maybel's stomach. Wrapped in every warm garment she possessed, Maybel had fought her way through the blinding snow, following the barely visible rope line Gideon had strung between the house and the barn. She found him inside, pale and grim-faced, his leg trapped beneath a fallen timber, the air thick with the scent of hay, and his quiet, ragged breathing. The calf, thankfully, was safe and huddled beside its mother. Getting him back to the house was an ordeal. He was a heavy man, and the pain made each movement agony. But Maybel, fueled by a desperate urgency, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Enid, her usual stern composure shattered by genuine fear, helped her settle him onto the large settee in the main room, his injured leg propped awkwardly. "It's just a sprain," he gritted out, his face tight with pain as Enid and Maybel worked to cut away his boot and trousers. Or maybe a break. Damn fool thing to happen. For the next few days, as the blizzard continued to rage outside, Maybel became his reluctant nurse. Enid, though worried, was stiff and awkward in the sick room, her skills more suited to running a household than tending to injury. It fell to Maybel to change his bandages, to bring him broth, to sit with him through the long, pain-filled nights when sleep eluded him. The enforced proximity was a strange kind of intimacy. She saw the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, the vulnerability he usually kept so carefully hidden. He was often silent, but it was a different silence now, less about distance and more about endurance. Sometimes he would watch her, his gaze thoughtful, almost questioning. One evening, as she adjusted the poultice on his swollen ankle, he spoke, his voice raspy. You're not like her." Maybel paused, her hands still. She knew he meant Clara, knew he was comparing her quiet competence, her uncomplaining fortitude, to the image he must have formed of her more delicate, perhaps more overtly refined, older sister. She looked at him then, directly into those winter sky eyes. "No, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice low but steady. "I am not my sister." It wasn't an apology, nor was it a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it felt like a declaration, a claiming of her own space, her own identity, in this house that was still not quite her home. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He merely grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and turned his gaze towards the fire crackling in the hearth. But something had shifted between them, a subtle acknowledgement that she was Maybel Vale, not a mere stand-in, not a shadow. It was during Gideon's convalescence that Enid, too, began to thaw, if only by a few degrees. Perhaps it was Maybel's unwavering care for Gideon, or perhaps the shared anxiety of the situation had chipped away at her reserve. One afternoon, as they sat mending by the fire, the storm finally abating outside, Enid began to speak, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. She spoke of her own past, a story Maybel had never imagined, of a husband lost to a logging accident, of a young son taken by fever one harsh winter long ago. She spoke of the grief that had hollowed her out, leaving behind a shell of pragmatic efficiency. "You lose enough, girl," Enid said, her gaze fixed on the darning needle in her hand, her voice rough with unshed tears. "And you learn to build walls, not to keep others out, but to keep what's left of yourself in." Maybel listened, her heart aching with a shared understanding. She finally saw beneath Enid's stern facade to the deep, enduring pain beneath. The housekeeper's rigidity wasn't coldness for its own sake. It was the armor of a woman who had loved and lost, and who feared to feel too deeply again. It didn't make Enid warm, not exactly, but it made her human, and Maybel found a new respect, a quiet empathy, for the older woman. A fragile understanding began to grow between them, nurtured in the shared silence of memory and loss. As the days lengthened, and the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh edges of the land, Maybel found herself with moments of quiet, solitary time. Gideon was slowly recovering, taking on more of his own care, and the rhythm of the ranch, though still demanding, allowed for brief respites. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, sitting in her small east room with the weak sunlight slanting through the window, that she felt a familiar ache, a longing for something she couldn't quite name. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother, to the faint, cherished image she held of her. Her mother had loved to draw, simple sketches of flowers and birds, images that had brought a rare, gentle smile to her face. On impulse, Maybel found a piece of discarded charcoal from the kindling box and a scrap of butcher paper Enid used for wrapping meat. Hesitantly, her fingers clumsy at first, she tried to sketch her mother's face from memory. The lines were uncertain, the likeness elusive, but as she worked, something deep within her stirred. It wasn't just about capturing a likeness. It was about connecting with a part of herself, a part of her past, that she had kept locked away. The drawing was crude, yet in the curve of a cheek, the remembered light in an eye, she found a flicker of solace, a sense of creation that was wholly her own. She had no fine paper, No proper pencils, but the urge to capture images, to give form to feeling, was undeniable. Here, in this place that seemed to value only the practical, the tangible, the laborious, Maybel Vale had stumbled upon a hidden wellspring within herself. She began to draw the landscape outside her window, the gnarled branches of the cottonwood tree by the creek, the distant, majestic peaks. It was a silent conversation, a way of seeing and understanding the world around her, and, perhaps, of understanding herself. Her art was a quiet rebellion, a testament to the enduring human need for beauty and expression. Even in the most unpromising soil, it was the beginning of a journey, a path she would walk alone. For now, in the heart of Heartwood, the tentative Montana spring, with its hesitant sunshine and the sweet, earthy scent of thawing soil, did little to soften the icy regard of Red Bluff's populace. If anything, Maybel's continued presence at Heartwood and the slow, begrudging recovery of its master seemed to fuel the town's simmering disdain. She was, and likely always would be in their eyes, the substitute, a constant, unwelcome reminder of Clara's flight, and Gideon Hart's apparent willingness to accept a lesser bargain. The whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket whenever she ventured into town for supplies. Sidelong glances from behind flour sacks at the mercantile. Conversations that abruptly ceased when she drew near the post office. One crisp Saturday, as she waited for Mr. Albright at the mercantile to tally her modest list of necessities. Thread. A new lamp wick. A small bag of horehound candies she'd hoped might soothe Enid's persistent cough. She felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. Mrs. Dovey's, the milliner, whose bonnets were as elaborate as her opinions were sharp, stood with two other townswomen, their heads bent together in a conspiratorial huddle. Maybel heard a snippet, a clearly enunciated, never the one he chose. Of course, a younger Maybel might have flushed with anger or shame. The Maybel who had weathered a Montana winter, who had nursed a taciturn rancher back from injury, and who had found a quiet solace in the stroke of charcoal on paper, merely straightened her shoulders. She turned, her gaze calm and direct, meeting Mrs. Davies' startled eyes. "Good morning, ladies," Maybel said, her voice even, carrying clearly in the small store. "A fine spring day, isn't it?" Mrs. Davies, flustered at being so openly acknowledged, stammered a non-committal reply. The other women suddenly found the contents of a notions display utterly fascinating. "Indeed, it is, Miss Vale," Mr. Albright interjected, his voice a little too hearty as he returned with her parcel. He, at least, treated her with a measure of professional courtesy. Perhaps because Heartwood's account was a valuable one, Maybel offered him a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Albright." She then let her gaze rest briefly on Mrs. Davies once more. "It's true, I wasn't the sister Mr. Hart initially corresponded with, but I am the one who is here. I am Maybel Vale, and I am making my place at Heartwood, not by default, but by the work of my own hands and the choices I make each day." She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse. She simply stated her truth, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I bear no ill will for what was, nor do I intend to apologize for what is." With a slight nod, she picked up her parcel and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She didn't look back. There was no triumph in the encounter, only a weary reaffirmation of her own resolve. She wasn't seeking their approval, only their acknowledgement that she was a person, not a placeholder. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the main room, mending one of Gideon's work shirts, the rhythmic stitch a counterpoint to the crackling flames, he surprised her. He'd been quieter than usual since his leg had healed enough for him to resume most of his duties. the shared intimacy of his convalescence receding with his returning strength. He walked over from his own chair, where he'd been silently observing her, and placed a small, softly wrapped bundle in her lap. "For your hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The wind out here, it's rough on the skin, especially with the lie." Maybel looked down, her fingers fumbling slightly with the twine. Inside the scrap of clean calico were a pair of gloves, not store-bought, but handmade, from supple, well-oiled deer hide. The stitching was a little uneven in places, clearly a man's work, but sturdy and careful. They were lined with soft rabbit fur, a luxury she hadn't dared imagine. They were made for her hands, by his. A warmth spread through her chest, so potent it almost hurt. This was more than a tin of salve, more than a curated bookshelf. This was time, effort, a tangible piece of himself. It was an acknowledgement, silent but profound. "Gideon," she began, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. They're beautiful." He merely grunted, a characteristic sound that usually signified dismissal. But his eyes, when they met hers for a fleeting moment, held a softness she was beginning to recognize. "Practical," he corrected, but there was no conviction in his tone. He retreated to his chair, picking up the stockman's journal as if the matter were closed. Maybel slipped her hands into the gloves. They fit perfectly. The soft fur, a gentle caress. Practical, yes, but also a shield, a comfort, a quiet message that perhaps, just perhaps, she was seen, truly seen. As Gideon's strength returned, the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythms. Yet something had subtly altered in the dynamic between them. The long evenings by the fire continued, not out of necessity now, but by an unspoken mutual consent. Sometimes they would talk, small exchanges about the day's work, the weather, the price of cattle. More often, they sat in a comfortable silence, Maybel sketching in a worn ledger book she'd salvaged, Gideon ridding or mending tack. She learned the cadence of his breathing, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was tired, the rare, almost imperceptible quirk of his lips that might have been a smile. It wasn't love as the poets described it, not the breathless passion Clara had yearned for. It was something quieter, deeper, an affection that needed no name, rooted in shared hardship, mutual respect, and the slow, patient tending of a fragile understanding. It was the comfort of presence, the solace of not being entirely alone in the vast, indifferent landscape. Her discovery of the children happened by chance. She'd ridden into a small, overlooked hollow a few miles from the main road, searching for a stray calf, when she came upon a cluster of dilapidated shacks. These were home to a handful of immigrant families, Irish, German, Scandinavian, drawn west by promises of land or work on the railroad, only to find themselves struggling on the fringes, forgotten and often scorned, their children, shy and wide-eyed, with clothes patched beyond recognition, watched her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They spoke little English, and their parents, worn down by labor and disappointment, had neither the time nor the means to see to their schooling. A familiar ache stirred in Maybel's heart. She saw in their eyes the same hunger for opportunity, the same quiet desperation she had once felt. An idea, bold and perhaps foolish, began to take root. The old, disused grain store at the edge of Hartwood's main yard, dusty and filled with cobwebs, could be cleaned. She had her books, her charcoal, a patient heart. When she proposed the idea to Gideon, not asking permission, exactly, but informing him of her intent, he listened in his usual stoic silence, his expression unreadable. "They're not our concern," he stated finally, his voice flat. Perhaps not yours. Mr. Hart, Maybel replied, her chin lifting. But they are mine. A mind left untended is a barren field. Surely even you can see the waste in that. He looked at her then, a long, considering gaze. The town won't like it. Stirring up the foreigners. The town doesn't much like me anyway, she said, with a wry twist of her lips. It will make little difference to my standing, and perhaps a great deal of difference to those children. He didn't forbid it, and in Gideon Hart's world, not forbidding was a form of consent. So, Maybel swept out the grain store, coaxed Enid into parting with a few chipped slates and some nubbins of chalk, and began her small school. At first, only a few children came, timid and hesitant, but Maybel's gentle persistence, her patient smiles, and the wonder of seeing their own names take shape under her guidance, soon drew more. She taught them their letters, simple sums, and told them stories. Stories of courage, of kindness, of faraway lands. She drew pictures for them, the animals of the prairie, the faces of their heroes. The backlash from Red Bluff was swift and predictable. Murmurs of meddling, of coddling those who should be working, reached Hartwood. Some ranchers, whose land bordered the immigrant settlement, made veiled threats about trespassing. Gideon remained impassive, offering no public support. But Maybel noticed that a fresh stack of firewood appeared outside the grain store one chilly morning, and a sturdy plank bench, suitable for small bodies, was suddenly propped against its wall. One evening, after a particularly trying day where two of her older students had been kept from class by their parents, who feared repercussions from a disgruntled neighbor, Maybel sat by the fire, her shoulders slumped with weariness. Gideon watched her from his chair, the silence stretching between them. He cleared his throat. You don't give up easy, do you? He observed, his voice softer than usual. Maybel managed a tired smile. There's too much at stake to give up. Mr. Hart. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if looking back through time. My mother, he said, his voice a low rumble. She was like that. Never saw a soul she thought wasn't worth lifting up. Stubborn as a mule when she believed in something, or someone. He paused, then looked directly at Maybel, his winter sky eyes holding a depth of emotion that made her breath catch. You're a lot like her, Maybel. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way the world usually understood it, but coming from Gideon Hart, a man who hoarded his words and his affections like a miser. It was something far more profound. It was a tribute, a mark of the deepest respect, a connection forged not in passion, but in the shared recognition of an unyielding spirit. Maybel felt a warmth flood her, a sense of validation that went bone deep. She wasn't his wife, perhaps never would be, but in that moment, she knew she was something more than the substitute. She was a woman he saw, a woman he respected, a woman who, in her own quiet, determined way, was beginning to rewrite not only her own story, but the silent, stoic narrative of Hartwood itself. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The comparison to Gideon's mother, a quiet but profound acknowledgement, had settled into Maybel's heart like a warming stone. It wasn't the fiery passion of dime novel romances, but it was something real, something earned, a bedrock of respect that felt more substantial than any fleeting infatuation. The small school in the grain store flourished, a pocket of noisy, hopeful life on the otherwise stoic ranch. The children, once shy and hesitant, now greeted her with eager smiles, their English improving with each passing week, their worlds expanding beyond the confines of their parents' hardscrabble existence. Even Enid had been seen leaving a basket of slightly misshapen cookies by the grain store door, a gruff, unspoken offering that Maybel understood perfectly. Life at Heartwood had found a new rhythm, one that included Maybel not as an interim solution, but as an integral part. The handmade gloves, now softened with use, were a constant reminder of Gideon's quiet regard. The shared evenings by the fire were a habit, a comfortable space carved out of the vast Montana silence, filled with the rustle of Maybel's sketching paper and the occasional low rumble of Gideon's voice commenting on a passage in his agricultural journals, or, more rarely, an observation about the day. He still hadn't spoken of permanence, of marriage, of a future defined, but his gaze, when it rested on her, held a new quality, a possessiveness, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet contentment of a man who has found something unexpectedly precious. Then, like an unseasonable frost threatening the new spring buds, Clara returned. She arrived on the afternoon stage from Red Bluff, unannounced, looking as out of place in her Eastern traveling dress against the rugged backdrop of Heartwood as a porcelain doll in a blacksmith's shop. Maybel was tending to a small patch of herbs near the kitchen door, her hands dusted with soil, her face shaded by a practical sunbonnet. When the stage pulled up, Gideon was out on the range. Enid, alerted by the rumble of wheels, appeared on the porch, her expression tightening into familiar lines of disapproval at the sight of the elegantly dressed visitor. Clara's eyes, wide and searching, swept over the scene before finally landing on Maybel. A complex mix of emotions flickered across her face. Surprise, a hint of dismay, and something that might have been pity. "Maybel," she called out, her voice thinner than Maybel remembered, carrying a note of strained disbelief. "Is that truly you?" Maybel straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Clara," she acknowledged, her own voice calm, steady. "This is unexpected." The reunion, if it could be called that, was strained. Clara, once settled in the main room with a cup of tea Enid had produced with ill-concealed reluctance, looked around at the rustic furnishings, her gaze lingering on the mended curtains, the worn spots on the braided rug. "It's all so primitive," she murmured, then seemed to catch herself. "I mean, so different from what I imagined, from what Gideon's letters implied." "Letters can paint any picture you wish them to," Maybel said quietly. "Life is what you find when you arrive." Clara launched into the reason for her sudden appearance. Things hadn't worked out for her back in Missouri. The teaching position she'd hoped for hadn't materialized, and the prospect of living as a genteel spinster under the critical eye of their Aunt Mildred had become unbearable. "I was wrong, Maybel," she confessed, her eyes pleading. "I was foolish and proud. This arrangement with Mr. Hart, it was a chance. I threw it away, but perhaps it's not too late." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "You must come home with me. Maybel, this is no life for you. You're young. You deserve more than this." She gestured vaguely around the room. "I'll speak to Mr. Hart. I'll explain. He'll understand. He chose me first." Maybel listened, her heart a strange mix of old sympathy for her sister's plight and a new, unshakable resolve. The idea of returning to Missouri, to the life she had so desperately fled, felt like being asked to shrink back into a skin she had long since outgrown. "Clara," she began gently, "I appreciate your concern, truly, and I'm sorry things have been difficult for you." She paused, choosing her words with care. "But my life is here now. Here." Clara's voice rose. "As what, Maybel? A housekeeper." A companion? He hasn't married you. Has he? The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. My role here isn't defined by a marriage certificate. Sister, Maybel replied, her gaze steady. It's defined by what I do, by who I've become. I teach the children. I help Enid. I belong here now. Belong? Clara scoffed lightly. You belong with your family. This is a wild, harsh place. And Mr. Hart, he's a stranger still. In many ways, he's not a stranger to me, Maybel said softly. Then, with a strength that surprised even herself, she met Clara's gaze directly. I'm not going back. Clara, when I came here, it was an escape, but I've chosen to stay, not to replace you, but to choose myself. This is my home now. Gideon returned as dusk was settling, his face grim when Enid quietly informed him of their visitor. The ensuing evening was thick with unspoken tensions. Clara attempted to engage Gideon in conversation, speaking of shared acquaintances in Missouri, of her renewed understanding of a rancher's needs. Gideon listened, his responses brief, his eyes often drifting to Maybel, who sat quietly mending, her silence a counterpoint to Clara's nervous chatter. Later, after Clara had retired to the east room, Maybel having quietly insisted on taking a cot in the warmer kitchen near Enid, Maybel found Gideon standing on the porch, staring out at the moonlit landscape. She wants me to leave with her, Maybel said, her voice barely above a whisper, stating the fact without embroidery. Gideon remained silent, his profile stark against the night. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Maybel felt a familiar ache of uncertainty. You haven't said anything. Gideon, do you wish me to go? He turned then, and in the dim light from the doorway, she saw the conflict in his eyes. He took a step towards her, his hand lifting as if to reach for her, then dropping to his side. This is your decision. Maybel, he said, his voice rough. Is it? She pressed, a sudden surge of frustration breaking through her composure. Or is it simply easier for you if I make it? You never asked me to stay. Not in words. His jaw tightened. He seemed to wrestle with himself, the effort visible in the taut line of his shoulders. When he finally spoke, the words were forced out, raw and uneven. I want you to stay. Maybel, he swallowed, his gaze fixed on her face. Truth is, I've wanted you to stay for a long time. I don't know how to say these things, right? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound awkwardness. This place, it was just a ranch before you came. Now, he trailed off, unable to articulate the change she had wrought. I'd be obliged if you'd consider remaining. It wasn't poetry, but it was Gideon's truth, hard-won and honestly offered. A slow warmth spread through Maybel, easing the tight knot of anxiety in her chest. Then I will stay, Gideon, she said softly. For me, and perhaps a little for you too. Clara left 2 days later, her face a mask of disappointment and wounded pride. There were no heartfelt farewells. Maybel wished her well, a quiet sincerity in her voice, but there was a gulf between them now, one that perhaps could never be bridged. In the weeks that followed, a new sense of peace settled over Maybel. Gideon's quiet admission had been a balm to her spirit. One cool spring morning, she took cuttings from a wild lilac bush she'd found blooming near the creek. Its fragrance a sweet reminder of Missouri hedgerows, but also a promise of new beginnings. Carefully, tenderly, she planted them along the fence line of the small yard surrounding the main house. She watered them, nurtured them, her hands shaping the soil. This wasn't land she owned by deed or title, but she was claiming it with her heart, marking her territory with living, breathing beauty. Enid watched from the porch, a rare, almost gentle expression on her face. Gideon, passing by on his way to the barns, paused, his gaze lingering on Maybel's bent figure, a silent acknowledgement of her quiet act of homemaking. She also began to write, not letters to anyone, nor grand pronouncements, but a simple journal, a recounting of her journey. She filled the pages of an old, discarded ledger with her neat script, detailing her arrival, the biting cold, the faces of the children, the subtle shifts in Gideon's demeanor, the gradual unfolding of her own spirit. She wrote of being born again in the snow, of finding herself in a place where she had expected only to lose herself. It was a testament to her own resilience, a private map of her transformation. The seasons turned, summer ripening into the golden hues of early autumn. The children in her makeshift school were learning, their laughter a bright thread in the fabric of Heartwood. One late afternoon, as a chill wind whispered of the coming winter, a dilapidated wagon rumbled up the track to the ranch. A young woman, barely more than a girl, her face pale and etched with fear, her body heavy with child, sat huddled on the wagon seat. The man, driving, a shifty-eyed drifter Maybel had seen once in Red Bluff, curtly explained that the girl, Rosalie, had been working at the saloon, had gotten herself in trouble, and had nowhere else to go. He'd heard tell that the folks at Heartwood were different. Maybel looked at Rosalie, saw the shame and desperation in the girl's haunted eyes, and her heart went out to her. Here was another soul rejected, another life cast adrift. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Bring her inside," Maybel said, her voice calm but firm, meeting Gideon's questioning gaze with a steady one of her own. "She can stay. We'll find room." Enid, after a moment's sharp intake of breath, merely nodded and turned towards the house, already considering linens and broth. Gideon watched Maybel, a complex emotion in his eyes. Surprise? Perhaps, but also a deep, affirming respect. Maybel gently helped Rosalie down from the wagon. The girl was trembling, tears streaming down her face. I have nowhere," she sobbed. "You do now," Maybel said, her arm around Rosalie's shaking shoulders, guiding her towards the house that had once been her own uncertain refuge. "You're safe here." Heartwood, once a bastion of solitary masculine endeavor, was changing. It was becoming a place of unexpected sanctuary, a haven not just for one mail-order bride who had refused to be a mere substitute, but for others who had been cast aside. Maybel Vale, who had come seeking a life, was now in the business of offering one. Her heart, like the lilacs she had planted, taking root and blossoming in the unlikeliest of soils. The arrival of young Rosalie, her belly round with impending motherhood, and her eyes haunted by a fear Maybel knew all too well, had indeed marked another subtle, yet profound, shift at Heartwood. The ranch, once a solitary bastion governed by Gideon Hart's stoic efficiency and Enid's rigid pragmatism, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a sanctuary. Maybel, the woman who had arrived as a reluctant substitute, was now its quiet, beating heart, her compassion a gentle force reshaping the contours of their isolated world. Rosalie's initial terror gradually gave way to a fragile trust under Maybel's steady kindness and Enid's surprisingly gruff, yet practical. "Care." Even Gideon, though his interactions with their new charge were minimal, ensured an extra supply of firewood was always stacked by the small cabin they'd fixed up for Rosalie, a silent acknowledgement of her needs. The small school in the grain store continued, a beacon of hope for the immigrant children. And now, Rosalie, too, found herself hesitantly tracing letters on a slate, a blush staining her cheeks as Maybel patiently guided her hand. The lilacs Maybel had planted along the fence line had taken root, their sturdy green leaves unfurling, a promise of future fragrance and beauty. Her journal, filled with the unfolding narrative of her second birth in the snow, was a private testament to a life she was actively forging, not one she had merely fallen into. But the Montana territories were a land of harsh beauty and even harsher realities. And peace, Maybel was learning, was often a fleeting season between storms. The next challenge arrived not as a whisper of gossip from Red Bluff, but in the swaggering, confident form of a man named Harlan Fitch. Fitch was a land speculator from the east, his clothes too fine for the rugged terrain, his smile too quick, his eyes holding a predatory gleam. He'd been buying up parcels of land bordering Heartwood, his ambitions as vast as the Montana sky. He rode in one blustery late autumn afternoon, the wind carrying the first icy bite of the winter to come, a palpable sense of menace preceding him. He dismounted with an air of proprietary ownership, his gaze sweeping over Heartwood with open assessment. Gideon met him on the porch, his stance as unyielding as the ancient pines that guarded the ranch. Maybel watched from the window of the main room, Rosalie and Enid hovering anxiously behind her. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. Fitch began, his voice carrying an oily confidence. I've come to make you a final offer on that north pasture of yours, the one bordering my new acquisitions. It's more valuable to me than it is to you. Stuck way out here. That pasture ain't for sale, Fitch, Gideon stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but carrying the weight of immovable conviction. Not now, not ever, Fitch chuckled, a humorless sound. Don't be sentimental. It's just land. And from the looks of those clouds building in the west, he gestured with a gloved hand towards the bruised, roiling horizon. You're about to have a blizzard on your hands. Might be a good time to lighten your load. Consolidate your holdings. He named a price, a respectable sum, but it was the underlying threat, the implication that he would get what he wanted one way or another, that hung heavy in the air. The answer is no, Gideon repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. Fitch's smile tightened. A man alone can only hold so much. Especially when the elements, and his neighbors, are against him. Before Gideon could respond, the door opened and Maybel stepped out onto the porch. She moved to stand not behind Gideon, but directly beside him, her small frame surprisingly resolute. Rosalie gasped softly from behind the curtain. Enid merely watched, her lips a thin, grim line. Maybel's gaze, clear and unwavering, met Harlan Fitch's. Mr. Fitch, she said, her voice calm but carrying a distinct firmness that cut through the wind's mournful sigh. This is Mr. Hart's land, and he has given you his answer. Fitch's eyes narrowed, flicking over Maybel with a dismissive air. And who might you be, little lady? The rancher's housekeeper. A spark ignited in Maybel's eyes. I have a name, she said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority that surprised even herself. It is Maybel Vale. I am not anyone else, and I will stand here, on this land, beside Mr. Hart. She took a small, almost imperceptible step closer to Gideon, a silent affirmation of their united front. Fitch looked from her to Gideon, a flicker of surprise, then annoyance, crossing his face. He clearly hadn't anticipated this kind of opposition, this quiet, unyielding solidarity. He opened his mouth to speak, then seemed to think better of it. With a curt, angry nod, he remounted his horse. You'll regret this, Hart, he spat, his gaze lingering on Maybel for a moment with something akin to grudging respect. Or perhaps just frustrated disbelief. Both of you. Then he wheeled his horse and rode away, a dark figure against the darkening, storm-laden sky. The blizzard hit that night, a raging white fury that descended upon Heartwood with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. Snow piled in monstrous drifts. The wind howled like a legion of banshees, and the world outside their sturdy log walls became a terrifying, amorphous blur of white. Gideon, despite Maybel's pleas to wait out the worst of it, had insisted on one last check of the north pasture, where a small herd of their hardiest cattle grazed. Fitch might be fool enough to try something under cover of the storm, he'd muttered, his jaw set. Hours later, Maybel, her heart a knot of icy dread, spotted him struggling back towards the house, a dim figure battling the blinding snow. He stumbled through the door, covered head to foot in ice, his face pale and drawn. He'd taken a bad fall on the treacherous, snow-covered ground. His arm hung at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was beginning to spread on his sleeve. Panic threatened to overwhelm Maybel, but the sight of Rosalie's terrified face and Enid's anxious pallor spurred her into action. Together, they helped Gideon to the settee, their movements urgent but careful. His arm was broken, no doubt about it. As Maybel worked with Enid to splint the limb, her mind raced. They were cut off, isolated, with a potentially dangerous enemy lurking nearby and a crippled rancher to care for. The storm raged for 2 days. Inside Heartwood, a different kind of battle was waged, one of quiet endurance and unwavering resolve. Maybel, with Enid's stoic assistance and Rosalie's timid help, tended to Gideon, kept the fires roaring, and managed the household. Gideon, though often gritting his teeth against the pain, directed their efforts from the settee. He fretted about the cattle, about Fitch, about their vulnerability. We hold the land by being on it. Gideon, Maybel said to him during one long, dark night, as the wind shrieked outside. She had just returned from a brief, perilous trip to the nearby barn with Enid to check on the milk cow and Rosalie's few chickens. Fitch can't take what we don't surrender. Our presence here, our refusal to break, that's our strength. Not guns, but our will to remain, and remain they did. They didn't venture out to confront Fitch, nor did he reappear, but they held their ground, their small, defiant household a beacon of warmth and life against the storm's fury and the chilling threat of human greed. They protected Heartwood not with violence, but with their unwavering presence, their shared belief in their right to be there, their absolute refusal to be driven away. Sometime during those storm-bound days, a letter arrived, brought by a near-frozen mail carrier who'd braved the abating tempest. It was from Clara. Maybel opened it with a sense of trepidation, expecting perhaps another plea, another lament, but the words inside were different. Subdued, almost resigned, Clara wrote of finding a small, quiet position as a companion to an elderly widow in a town far from Missouri, a life of modest routine and predictable calm. There were no accusations, no demands, only a brief, almost wistful mention of the Montana spring she had so briefly witnessed. It was, Maybel realized, Clara's silent acknowledgement, her final retreat, an admission, perhaps, that Maybel had dared to choose a life, a path that she herself had not possessed the courage, or perhaps the constitution, to embrace. Maybel folded the letter, a quiet sadness for her sister mingling with a profound sense of her own hard-won peace. When the blizzard finally broke and a pale sun glinted on a world transformed by snow, Gideon, his arm bound securely, his face still pale, but his eyes clear, watched Maybel as she moved about the room, bringing order back to their snow-sieged lives. That evening, as a fragile quiet settled over Heartwood, he called her to his side. "Maybel," he began, his voice still hoarse, his good hand reaching for hers, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'm not a man for fancy speeches. You know that." He looked down at their joined hands, then met her gaze. His eyes filled with an emotion that made her heart ache with its intensity. "This ranch, it needs a heart. You've given it one. I need one too." He took a deep breath. "I'm not good with words, Maybel, but I'll be here. Every morning, every season, whatever comes." He paused, a rare vulnerability softening his rugged features. "Everything. I don't know how to say. Everything I should. I'll learn to show you. If you'll have me. If you'll be my wife." Tears welled in Maybel's eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a profound, quiet joy. This was Gideon's proposal, as unadorned and as steadfast as the man himself. It was a promise not of flowery romance, but of enduring presence, of a shared life built on respect, understanding, and a love that had grown slowly, surely, like the deep roots of the ancient pines. "Yes, Gideon," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." Word of their impending marriage, and of Harlan Fitch's thwarted ambitions, he eventually sold his holdings at a loss and departed the territory, defeated more by the Heartwood spirit than any overt aggression, spread through Red Bluff, and slowly, the way people spoke of Maybel began to change. She was no longer the substitute sister or Hart's mail-order woman. They spoke of her quiet strength, her kindness to the immigrant children, her unwavering loyalty. They spoke of her as Maybel Hart, the woman who had faced down storms, both natural and human, and had not only survived but had thrived. She was the woman who had made a frozen place bloom. And every spring, as the snows receded and the Montana earth breathed anew, the lilac bushes Maybel had planted along the Heartwood fence burst into fragrant, vibrant life, their purple and white blossoms, a splash of tender beauty against the rugged landscape, were a living testament, a fragrant reminder of the girl from Missouri who had been rejected, who had chosen to stay, and who, by the quiet courage of her own heart, had found her truest self and her deepest belonging in the heart of the wild, untamed West. If this story stayed with you, if something in Maybel's silence or the snowbound quiet reminded you of your own reckonings, then don't keep it to yourself. Tell me what you felt. Did she make the right choice? Did you see yourself in her, or in the way he finally learned to stay without asking? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, quiet ones that bloom where no one expects them to, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next.